Good evening, everyone. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion, Reimagining Learning and Research in a Global Crisis, an Avery and GSAPP Open Forum, co-sponsored by Avery and the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia. I'm Hannah Bennett, Director of Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library. Joining me are Dean Amal Andras of GSAPP, Atea Korakuala, Assistant Professor in GSAPP's doctoral program in architecture, Charlotte Caldwell, currently a doctoral student, and a Provost Diversity Fellow studying the history and theory of architecture at Columbia. Charlotte's research focuses broadly on 19th century American architecture through a vernacular architectural perspective. And finally, Kate Campbell, hailing from a small town in Ontario, Canada. Kate is a scholar, maker, and curatorial thinker. A recent graduate of the GSAPP program, the Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architecture program. She is currently working on Wedging Forward, a community play arts program for formerly incarcerated persons, developed as part of her master's thesis. Kate is now conducting a summer workshop at GSAPP exploring the school's history as an institution of higher learning and connection. She is also this year's Campbell Award. Thank you all panelists so much for taking part in this conversation. Before we begin, I'll review this evening's prompt. Over the past year, Columbia swiftly reinvented itself to ensure continued instruction and access to its scholarly resources. Still, safety concerns have led to painful limitations across its various schools, centers, and libraries. GSAPP reimagines the design studio and fabrication lab as a virtual learning environment. To better serve its core communities, the Avery Library has had to turn away numerous other audiences reliant on its archives, raw materials, and research collections. Just as many public archives and research collections shuttered themselves to all. These constrictions have necessitated new approaches to design, research, and documentary methodologies, which are simultaneously being challenged by growing awareness of structural biases and exclusionary practice. To start, each panelist will have about 5 or 6 minutes to quickly offer from their distinct perspectives as academic administrators, library administrators, educators, and students, the challenges the pandemic has brought, and especially what they hope to return to, and what they see as a potential positive change in research and teaching. Then we will discuss a series of questions among the panelists. And then following that, we'll open up the floor to all participants, and everyone's encouraged to engage in the dialogue through the Q&A chat. Our questions are intentionally general so that everyone will be able to bring in any number of perspectives or ideas. The program is intended to last around an hour and a half. So not in some invites it said 9 p.m. It's not lasting till 9 p.m. So I will ask Amal to begin, Dean Andreas, to share her thoughts about the past year in relation to teaching and learning.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for suggesting this panel. I love the fact that we have a really interesting cross-section here on the screen of scholars and practitioners of different levels who are passionate about libraries. And so I thought two things for me. First, I think for GSAPP, we always think of ourselves as completely like connected to Avery in a way that is visceral. I mean, we're above it, we're below it. It's really at the core physically and also intellectually. And at the same time, it's this kind of reference that we're constantly trying to transform, push back, open up, add new things. It's incredibly present. And so I think that when that core was closed, one of the first closures with the pandemic, it really sort of signaled what was to come, which is this sort of unbelievable dispersal, everybody sort of in the sense of isolation, disconnection, and I mean, the library being not only a place of research, but a place of encounter, serendipity, surprise, community in an odd way, right? Because it's also, I mean, intimidating, especially Avery, and has this kind of, something was lost. But I also, as a practitioner, actually, we've done quite a few libraries, and we're currently working on a library in Boulder, Colorado, and a library in Dumbo, which will open in September. And it's been incredible to see how important public libraries. I mean, I was at OMA in the days of Seattle, where everybody was predicting the death of the book, and of course the book never died, and the virtual qualities of the ebook never replaced the physicality of the book. But more importantly, it was a moment where public libraries became so much more than just spaces of research. They really became places for a very, very wide range of community members to kind of find a place to come in, to learn in second language, sometimes to use the bathrooms. I mean, it's amazing that libraries are still, that kind of spaces of higher education and learning, but also still providing at times shelter. There's so very, very few architectural sort of typologies that can still span that cross section. So, and the fact that now public libraries are spaces where vaccines are being provided, and it just shows the central role of libraries and public libraries, and still in American society and elsewhere, which is incredible privilege. I think that not many countries have. So so the kind of it's an amazing time to both recognize the importance of libraries, both in universities and outside, and also kind of take stock of what was lost and what was gained through the lens, I think, of the library.
Thank you very much. Atea.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Hannah, for putting this together. I look forward to all of the things that we're going to talk about today. Thank you all. That was a great way to kind of enter this discussion. I've been thinking about what libraries, but not one libraries have meant, but also what librarians have meant to all of us, in putting together syllabi and in putting together our own bibliographies and our research, in helping us structure our research. And I think that's been one of the things that is perhaps one of the ways in which I could sort of talk about what this last year, more than a year now, has meant, because one, of course, librarians really helped in making sure things were available when putting together syllabi, because there was a moment there where I just couldn't even imagine what how to bring new material to syllabi, how to sort of put together ways for students to access things that would otherwise be put on reserve or something like that. And so I think what in terms of teaching, what happened in this last year was that it really challenged me to maybe reconsider how students are what ways they're kind of taking in information from the world. And I think the library became a way to kind of give access to, even things like podcasts that were sometimes behind paywalls, and books that, I don't know if this is, but books that were just brand new that, we could suddenly have multiple copies of that, because we could have them via the kind of licensing system instead of having a physical copy. And so I just want to say that it's been challenging in that sense, in an interesting way to transform syllabi and it will be interesting to see how this kind of continues over the next few semesters. What was wonderful is that because we had more access to primary material online, we could even put that on syllabi. On the other hand, of course, research and writing have different challenges, and also helping students do research. And of course, I have some more things to say about this as we continue this conversation. But I think one way to kind of introduce, at least the way I've been thinking about it, is how do you sort of, instead of expecting students to sort of creatively reimagine everything, just also find a way to do research more slowly, because you really want them to be able to research the things they want to research and not just research things that are available. And I think that became one of the things that was that required all of us to develop new skills to just help students get through those kinds of things. I'll maybe pause now and talk more about things in the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Atea. Charlotte.
Thank you so much for putting this together, Hannah. And I'm so grateful that we're having this conversation together. When I'm thinking about just the pandemic, there are just so many privileges and then missed opportunities and then hardships that came about with it. And it really very much depended on people's location and their locality. It's unfortunate that we lost the library experience as itself, and not just doing research, but the act of being in the library. I remember singing at my carol and then being able to have the books that I would want to have, having conversations with staff and then also my colleagues. That's all gone. You can have it to a certain degree, but it's not the same. And then we can't even support our libraries the way that we want to. So that experience, as somebody who appreciates the library just in general, before I even considered going into academia, that whole experience of being in the library. And then I'm coming from a relatively privileged situation in terms of access. A lot of my colleagues during the year of the pandemic couldn't access the resources they would want to and needed in order to work on their dissertation, their exams. I myself, most of my materials for my comprehensive exam were either online, and I'm also privileged enough to live not too far away from the University of Pennsylvania, so I could take the train and go there and use my alumni card to use the library. And then also having access to books that I had already owned. Most people didn't have that access, which is really unfortunate. And I think the pandemic very much exacerbated this this hardship that I don't think other people realize unless you're actually really doing research. And then another thing in terms of teaching, I think it brought out good and the bad being that you lose that experience of being able to teach in class and meeting your students instead of phantoms online. But then also I commend the librarians, because this is why we need them. And Atea, you said this, is that right when it hit, Avery had a repository of how to use the library remotely. And I very much appreciated that. I made something that I call the COVID packet for my master's students for the architectural history class I was teaching, to show them. And it actually, I think, forced them in a good way to start to use resources that they probably wouldn't have used otherwise because of the situation. Forcing them in a good way out of their comfort zone to use these resources that have always been there, but then now they have to think out of the box and become better researchers, better students. Not that they weren't before, but using these new resources or unused resources to continue their projects, but then also fully realizing that not everybody can easily access these materials. Not everybody has access to good or reliable internet. Some people probably had to buy a better computer. Some people have to stay up really late or get up really early in order to come to class, or even have an appointment. So all of those things, I think also forced me to be a lot more patient and accepting of the situation. I mean, I think we've all gotten to that point where we accept that this is Zoom life and things happen, they just do. But in the relative sense, I think we all worked with each other to get through it. And then one more thing, and then I'll stop talking so Kate can talk. I think just in terms of networking and working with your colleagues, Zoom and just having everything online made it easier to see people around the world. But then, unfortunately, like I said, where you lose the live-in experience with the library, you lose the live-in experience with the classroom, you lose that when you can't be in the same room with your colleagues and then discuss research. You have to set up a time. There's never this informality of walking into a space and then just talking about your work, unless you live near your colleagues. I unfortunately do not. So that is just one of those things that I think if someday we could work around the pandemic and, you know, get to some sense of normalcy, we can get back to, or maybe we just get used to this new norm. I guess this is something we'll talk about more, but that's just one of the questions that is plaguing me basically in terms of this new life that we have.
Thanks. Thanks, Charlotte. Kate.
Hi, thank you so much, everybody, so far. Before I get into things, just want to congratulate my graduating class at Columbia, at GSAPP, and kind of around the world, which of course, you know, brings me to the point. It's such an astounding time to graduate or to go through any sort of like formal system of education or even informal system of education. Thinking through this kind of as a difficult time, I was thinking a lot about this kind of the language about responding to this present moment, which is very common. And I think, you know, I started thinking about, okay, well, who's responding to whose moment? And then, you know, whose responsibility is it in terms of, is it the institutions? Is it the students? Is it the faculty to kind of like step up in such like a time of change? Great shift. And then I guess, which brings me to the kind of final point, it's like, how do we work together? I think that for me, that's been the biggest thing, is that because maybe archives weren't as available, or the physical library space wasn't available, it was really about like making connections and building networks within the institution, within the library, and then within the community. As Hannah mentioned in her introduction for my thesis, I developed a community project. And so much of that relied upon the fact that I was able to work through networks like the library. And I connected with people with the New York Public Library System as well to kind of get the word out and really again, connect people and connect resources to ideas. And I think the thing that I think about, one of the things I think about most is the fact that we've been able to connect with people all around the world. I mean, I have developed friendships with people in South Africa, all across the country, people in Canada that I never would have, like Canadians here in the United States, I never would have been able to connect with. So I think that it's been a very safe time and a very, a time, as someone said, you know, a moment of pause, a moment of patience, a moment of peace to kind of, you know, really dig into yourself and find out those people that you want to connect with and those networks, and find out what's important to you and how to use the networks that we are developing and the people that we're working with. And more directly speaking to the pandemic, I think that for me, so much about it is, again, this intersection, is the intersection of this present moment, this change, what resources really are important to me when nothing is really available. You know, admittedly, I did not use some of the electronic resources as well as I probably should have throughout the pandemic. And I think, again, for me, it was an opportunity to look within myself and to kind of connect with maybe some physical materials, and really, you know, it's about like emailing artists, like directly emailing artists. You know, Nicole Fleetwood and her show, she's been a huge help with my work. directly emailing the authors, connecting people by email, just kind of like putting yourself out there. I think that that's been one of the most important lessons. And, you know, having groups like the library and GSAPP administration kind of behind you when you're doing these things has been, it's how it works. So yeah, thank you.
That's really wonderful. Thank you. I'll just share a few thoughts of my own in getting everything accomplished that we could in this last 15 or 16 months. As you all know, in February, we found out about the pandemic. It was in full swing. And then all of a sudden, the library system had to reinvent itself in March. So we had a very short period of time to really react swiftly with the being very mindful of what a campus closure will mean for graduate students, for in-person teaching, and for access to pivotal resources. I made the, some might say, the iconoclastic move to begin circulating part of Avery's collection for the fall semester. So we did have the spring semester to gear up for this, and this was a difficult choice, but my feeling was if we don't make our collections for those who are on campus or on site, if now's not the time to make these things a little more accessible, when is the right time? So that was a really difficult decision. I know for the curators in Avery, it was very hard to figure out quickly how to move instruction and access to our archives online. And we've experimented with a number of different approaches where we're providing online, on-demand kind of scanning. We're working with faculty with new online instruction and so on and so forth. But it was really painful to kind of really sort of shorten or reduce quite quickly the kinds of services our special collections served. And this certainly impacted our immediate communities, but most certainly our international communities that have come to use a lot of our special collections. So there was a real hardship expressed among our international constituencies to this immediate closure and problematic access for non-affiliates. Nevertheless, I think what we've seen is a real swift response on the part of the libraries as we're kind of making things up as we go along. We work very closely in online instruction and online reference to get people what they needed. The libraries, of course, embarked in this program called the HATI Emergency Temporary Access Service, which made close to 3 million volumes available digitally that wouldn't have been available normally. So we really kind of hustled, and I just applaud my colleagues across the library system for getting things done in such a professional and comprehensive way. So as I think about the last year and a half, one of the things that's been a real challenge for me is I haven't been able to really connect with students and faculty the way one normally would have with campus in full normal swing and classes in full normal swing. So in building my own sense of community with our constituencies, it's largely been online and through kinds of sometimes panicked questions and sometimes real interesting points of engagement. So what I'd like to reflect on, I think, and certainly we can carry on about this throughout the conversation, is this new kind of community. We're coming out of a collective trauma. We're realigning ourselves with resources that weren't available to us before the pandemic. And in some ways, we're completely resetting our traditional relationships with one another. And I'm really excited to explore that. And and here we are now thinking about reopening the libraries, bringing everyone back, and doing this all in a safe and meaningful way. So those are some of my initial thoughts. I guess I'll launch into a question, and I'll invite the panelists to volunteer some responses and reflections. This is kind of building on what we've already talked about. We've talked about our experience through the pandemic and the sort of immediate impressions and ramifications. But one of the things I'd love for you all to share a little bit more about is, what certainly your research, but what other things that are goals or ambitions were prevented or sidelined by the pandemic, and what pre-pandemic challenges remain.
Well, maybe one question I have, Hannah, for you is that it seemed to me, at least at Avery, that before the pandemic and certainly under Carol Ann's directorship, there was a real emphasis on what is an archive, what is an architectural archive, what is the future of archives, digital archives, how do we, and the kind of obsession with that. I mean, I don't mean it so negatively, but it's and you and I have spoken about the question of equity. Who are the architects who are able to organize their own archive before they either donated? This is sort of this whole digital realm, and so this as a kind of big question mark, what is an original drawing? What is, there's a lot of kind of authorship issues around that, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking about the CCA and the exhibition that they, the question of the digital, and then in relation, I think, to issues of equity in terms of, for me, who gets to curate, even think about these things. And then in contrast, what you described is that the pandemic forced or invited a very welcome, urgent access to all, right? We're going to scan. We're going to, increase access. We're going to, and so maybe I'm wondering about whether it went from a kind of, I'm thinking, Frank Lloyd Wright, drawings coming in, and then this sort of the pandemic and what it leaves us with, which is, what is gained and what is lost. Do you kind of reassess through that lens of access and sort of privilege, let's say, which Charlotte was already talking about in terms of physical access. Does it kind of reorient a little bit the priorities of libraries in universities, for example?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think one of the sort of challenges, it's not a new challenge, but it's a fairly recent one for archives within libraries, well, archives in general, architectural archives, is acquiring more of the digital and preserving it and making it accessible years from now. And that's a real challenge for the profession, and we're still struggling with how to do this in a way that is in perpetuity. But a lot of these particular kinds of collections are from places that have the means to organize and design with technologies that are pretty advanced and are doing really interesting things with technologies like AR and VR possibly, and all of these sorts of immersive experiences, and that alone poses a huge challenge to us regardless of the pandemic. What the pandemic, I think, offers archives now is a new way to partner with different kinds of architectural firms. And that's not to say we needed the pandemic to do this, but I think as we think about equity and inclusivity and diversity, not just in terms of voices, but in terms of kinds of projects and kinds of geographies represented in the archives, we have the means to pursue these sorts of partnerships with different kinds of firms, designers, and scholars that might, perhaps redefine some of some of the components of an architectural archive. As we've discussed in planning for this, my experience with some of these bigger architectural firms is not so much donating collections in this day and age, but selling collections to universities that can afford them, basically. And not all architects can put them. I mean, I'm not an architect. I don't want to speak out of turn, but not every firm has the means to connect with big universities like Columbia. And so what I would love to see happen post-pandemic is changing the kinds of discussions we have and finding new kinds of targets for our collections. And as we talked, and I want to hear Kate and Charlotte jump in about this too, is redefining what is a gap in an archive. Is it something that we just traditionally have never collected because of format or scope, or is it something that falls outside of what we've, what is it just something that changes the way in which we curate archives altogether, like these new sorts of partnerships? So I guess this is all just to say that Avery has a real responsibility to uncover some of these perhaps smaller archives, perhaps novel archives, perhaps archives put in digital ephemeral formats, and really kind of, I think, be on the sort of threshold of reconstituting a conversation, if that makes sense.
Right, and I think, in terms of inequity and just who has access to what, there are some libraries and archives that wouldn't even be able to afford to buy collections. And then it would just, Avery Library has privileges and resources that other libraries don't have. But that's relative. And I think in a certain sense, it's gotten us to appreciate these sources and then possibly to find ways to keep them open. And it's not like they were going to close, but to add to their legitimacy. I guess their cultural capital. I don't think people realize something's useful until it's almost gone or gone. And not that Avery Library would disappear, but other ones might because of the situation. I think it's also good, Hannah, when you mentioned this before, like different types of material that's archived in different types of ways. And then how these gaps, because the gaps don't necessarily have to be, finding historically marginalized architects, but maybe they're architects that relate to issues of class, gender, all these things intersect with each other. They're really important, so they're not all siloed, or even different ways of formatting so that you can see architectural collections in different ways. Or even a hybrid situation, which we had before, but I think now, since it's so part of our everyday lexicon, that I feel like people can shift their brains into thinking, okay, I can look at the physical and I can also look at the digital and see them and compare them. But yeah, I think what's really important to me is just the fact that we have to appreciate these things and preserve them. And it's just a scary moment that these places can close and that we can't get to them and we can't support them. But, just adding to that cultural capital and importance of why we have libraries and why we have archives. And that they're for everybody, that access. Like, you don't have to be a researcher, you don't have to be a PhD student. You can use the library and just learn. So, and I think everybody just figuring out different ways to have access to these materials and then also how to reformat them will bring different people. It might be wishful thinking this because people have different associations and relationships with libraries and archives, but I do believe it would make these spaces more accessible to people.
Oh, Caitlin, I'll be quick. So one of the things I was thinking is, of course, these things that one brings to archives, the final destination of that is not the archive, right? The archive is a place from which you access them again. And on the one hand, it poses immense challenges digitally because you need to have them at high resolution, but also at low resolution. You need to have metadata on it. You need to have these objects need some way to be found, and the ways in which we find these objects are multiple. Like somebody needs to also research that object so that another person can put that into a lecture. Like, how does something from an archive end up in an article, in an essay, and finally in a lecture? Like, in a way, a lecture tends to be the last place it ends up in, because when one is putting together a lecture, you really need material on the object. You can't just have the object alone. So it has to be researched so that it can go into that lecture. So I think this huge challenge is posed in terms of how do we make these objects speak? What is it that we can, how do we make them accessible so in ways that they are actually legible, so that they can actually circulate in ways that are meaningful and not just as images of themselves? And I think that's there are just so many questions around that, which, like, I know that there are some repositories where you have to be within the physical space to even access it digitally. And that's important because for whoever may have donated that collection, or however the rights around those things are structured, mean that you can't just access it just because it exists. And so I think it on the one hand, it requires us to have historical and intellectual literacy, but it also requires us to have kind of copyright literacy, and it also requires us to have certain kinds of digital literacy. And so suddenly, the space of the archive becomes a place to learn so many more things than the thing you may have originally gone in to see. And I think that poses some real challenges to us moving forward in terms of how we even understand what it means to do archival research in terms of accessing material.
I think that that's a really good place for me to kind of follow up. Responding specifically to your prompt, Hannah, about these kind of gaps in the archive, I think very much about two kind of arenas of thought. The first one is connected to Charlotte's points about historically marginalized voices. I think very much so bodies, and I think about typology. So I think, of course, as she mentioned, so it's not just maybe about like BIPOC, it could be female, non-binary, it could be, different emerging artists or practitioners, international. I think one of the biggest things is, again, talking about this opportunity has made us exposed us to so many different people internationally and around the globe, and kind of taking an opportunity. And I think that, when we think about these gaps in the archives and these voices that may have been missing or are missing, I think it's an opportunity to think, well, why do they exist? And who do they serve when these gaps were created? Who do they serve? Well, in many circumstances, they serve the institutions and who hold these archives, because a lot of some of their histories are not something that they want to make public or archives. And I mean, it's not even specifically talking about Avery or Columbia. It's just different institutional archives in general. I mean, we're talking about museum spaces as well. And I think the second point I really think about is kind of typologies and what really qualifies or quantifies or constitutes an archive. Over the process of doing a lot of research for my workshop, and then as well for my thesis, I found out many different kind of forms of archives that exist here at the very institution. So a great example of that is the zine library at Barnard College. It's one of the oldest zine archives in the world, started in 2011. And so, just kind of like developing an understanding of, okay, so like what information is really kind of deemed as is high, of a high value or educational, and who can use this and who has access to this information. The other thing I think about is different forms of oral history projects or visual or photographic projects that have come up. Or even, I mean, this very room that we're in right now is an archive, right? In terms of like, when we all signed in, we all had to say like, we're recording this. So this is archived on YouTube, and understanding that over the past year, where there's been so many amazing conversations just at GSAPP alone, the different events and different people who've come in, and even just within GSAPP students as well, very different advocacy roles. I think that it's amazing if we think about kind of how an archive can expand, and how this, the era of the pandemic and this moment has, at least for me specifically, and I think maybe a number of people that I work with directly, who understand an archive in very different ways because because they don't have access to those physical archives, or they don't have access to those conversations that would lead them to specific archives or those different institutions. So yeah, I think that's kind of wraps it up. Thank you so much.
No, those are wonderful points. Thank you all. What I think, this exposes, and as I think about, libraries and archives, and so much needs to be put online, not just because of ease of access for those that have access, but also for preservation purposes as well. It puts a real demand on the technology and the way in which these sorts of materials are made accessible. It's something that's been a challenge for even just normal online platforms serving straight up full text articles and dissertations and whatnot. But as the objects themselves become more complex, and the question of how to discover them is even more pressing, the technology behind all of this really comes into question. And that's, I think, going to be a huge challenge, not just for libraries, but for people that, organize this kind of content and make it accessible even through commercial platforms. So it's going to be an interesting challenge. And it gets to what you were saying, Atea, which is, discovering the online object in a way that's meaningful and relevant, and perhaps serendipitous, but what does that look like? And is it a consortial kind of field where we're blending archives together, we're using linked data to make connections for people? These are all sorts of ethical questions about superimposing intent through technology, but also supporting the collections through technology, which is super important. So anyway, thank you all. That's really interesting. I would just also say that in terms of the challenges that will wait for us after the pandemic is sort of a larger field challenge, and what I've experienced just as an observer, but also a participant and as a colleague to folks in cultural heritage institutions and museum libraries and other kinds of collections is a vulnerability of these institutions just because of economic challenges pre and post pandemic. And sadly, Columbia is privileged in that this isn't as much of an issue for art history departments or classics departments, but we've seen lots of higher ed institutions dispersing of these programs because of the solvency issues in maintaining them. So I think there's also going to be even more of an imperative to put finer points and more immediacy and relevancy in terms of how we capture scholarly expression in libraries and where we identify it, because it is tied to also production. If scholars aren't able to, specialize in a particular area because of, economic constraints at their particular institution, that, has its own kind of problem in terms of voices in the fields. And so these are things that are definitely at the forefront of my mind, and things that we think about in terms of maintaining the way in which we collect materials. So it's kind of it's not the happiest kind of challenge, but it's a very real one. And for those of you guys going into the field now or about to, and thinking about curricular planning, I'm just curious how how you've thought about some of this.
Yeah, I think this sort of reminds me of something Kate said earlier in terms of amplifying voices, and then the fact that certain strains on the archive can have a huge impact on the researcher, but also reminds me of some of our planning sessions where we were talking about language and translation. I mean, for myself, most of my material is in English, and I'm also a native speaker of English. So that's my relative privilege in that situation. But somebody who's coming from the outside, using these materials, they might be their second language, but then also how do they, if they want to do a project where the materials are not in a certain language, and if they're not in the archive, you have to plan around that. And that could stifle research, that could stop you from looking at a certain topic because of the translation issues. But then also translation, the meaning changes once it goes from one language to another. So how do we, I don't know, maybe this could be a question we could talk about or not, but how do we access these materials? Or how do we acquire these materials so that there are different voices in different languages from different regions, but then also you don't want to extract materials from their regional context where they probably belong in the first place. So there are all these different situations of access that make this whole phenomenon complicated, because you want your students to reach out and look at different materials, but how can they do that if they don't know the language? How can you teach it if you don't know the language? I know that's like an issue myself with some classes, because I would like to teach about other places, but I don't necessarily know how to get those materials or can read those materials. But how can libraries and archives maybe assist in terms of translation to help with those materials and make them more accessible?
I think it's a really good place to jump in. I think for me, it's one of the things that's really astonished is the different reading lists that have come out of kind of the various moments of kind of institutional change. And I guess, the libraries are fundamental in helping to form these things in terms of, and again, it's not specifically within kind of maybe cultural reading lists. They're also very much like focused on kind of, architectural history, expand architectural histories, or talking about different forms of different animal life. I just think that this has been a very good time for people to kind of return to these like collective forms of communications, kind of like salon style, even though we're all not in like a cool space, we're on Zoom. But I think I was really kind of taken by your terms, the scholarly expression in terms of like different ways to kind of navigate this. And then I thought about a lot about different forms of teach-ins that have happened over the year. Basically starting in the last year, and the different kind of conversations that have happened. And the fact that having an institution like Avery, like GSAPP around us as kind of budding scholars has allowed us to form maybe more advanced discussions than we would be able to have elsewhere or in different channels. And so I think that it's been a very good time to kind of, I guess, going back to what I said earlier, like what does scholarly expression look like? What do kind of these different exchanges of voices and how does that function?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Actually, Kate, I love that. It's true. The change came through reading lists. It's like, here's another list, and here's another list, and here's another archive, and so which was kind of central to all these conversations. But I also was in Hannah, in the title of the event is the question of partnerships, and the question of partnerships came up quite a bit. Like, who does one partner with? What are typical partnerships for institutions? What other libraries, does Avery partner with? And speaking to the question of the gap or not extracting or and preserving or or supporting. I think it's a very interesting time to rethink one's partnerships, and what is the two-way exchange, and who's on the other way of that two-way, and where is that smaller institution or situated. I think in a way this would be the gain. I think, Kate, you were referring to, like, with the click, you're suddenly in Johannesburg or in Addis Ababa or anywhere, and so that click could be made more institutional through kind of new forms of partnerships and allyships for kind of libraries in a way. I'm thinking also, I mean, even institutions like the Met are, like, rethinking, in a timely, the objects, right? There's a different kind of object, but the objects that are in their galleries, and how do you both create an archive of quote unquote global knowledge, but recognize that this is the result of conflict and extraction and processes that are really questionable, and yet these objects can tell so much. So it's just a very interesting time to rethink these practices.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about when I was from some of the questions that Hannah has put together was all of the labor that goes into scanning things across the world. And a lot of this labor, you still can't access it easily. You can't access the material because it still requires you to be part of some sort of institutional network to be able to get to things. But then on the other side of that, one of the things that Charlotte said sort of made me think about was that at some level, we also always, I didn't ever see myself as a collector of material when I was, in the early years of my education. But over the years, one collects things that one doesn't realize will not necessarily be available later on. We sort of, on one hand, we inhabit this kind of space of Google Books and Amazon, where you can get whatever you want at any time. But on the other hand, there are still things like, zines is one example, but there's pamphlets and things that really do disappear. And in a way, how do we balance this thing where people who have platforms, like the platforms we're speaking from, were heard a lot. And then on the other hand, there's people who speak in other languages and who have access to all of these objects and who have been collecting them for years. How do we hear those voices as well? And so there's, that, I think that goes to one of the themes that's been being talked about here today, that Amal, that you mentioned as well, which is partnering, not just with, the big institutions, but also seeing each of us as part of this network and as having collections that we've been slowly putting together over the years. And that these sort of give us ways to access ideas and information, and then in that way, when we bring the people who do this collecting on, it's somewhat less extractive in a sense. I don't know, maybe that's not correct. There's always that element of extraction, but at least I hope that that also brings the kind of individuals back into the network.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the pieces, what you were just saying, what that brings to mind is, as we put more and more online, digitally, of course, and curate that new kind of engagement, there is still physical production, obviously, and that kind of access is very, very different. But what I've been finding in the arts and humanities is that print production is becoming, even among trade publications, and even not so much university presses, but certainly all kinds of trade publications, from Lars Mueller to Tasch, and to all of these different kinds of publishers. They're putting in a new kind of artistic intent into the production of an actual volume. And this is not to say that all of a sudden Routledge is now in the artist book business. They're not at all, but it's an important component, and I'm seeing it more with smaller presses and, you know, these very sort of short run, interesting kinds of format, their own kind of scholarly / design expressions, and I really want to figure out a way to make that kind of experience accessible to people that may not be able to visit the actual object and engage with it in ways. And how does that happen? 3D scanning? Probably not, but you know, some way through maybe cataloging, through ethical cataloging, through description, you know, or sort of through digital description, unlocking this physical intent, which, you know, is so important to some of these productions. And, you know, after all, like, imagine if we were just tossing archograms back in the 60s, all of that interesting content would have been lost, as seen as, you know, just silly ephemeral things we don't need to hang on to. So I think this just reinforces what you all were saying about zine, you know, like these different kinds of publications and the different kinds of collections that can really help distinguish us while supporting, you know, these marginal voices or new kinds of scholarly inquiries. So that's all very, very interesting. Thank you for your thoughts on that.
But Hannah, I love the idea of 3D scanning. Right? If you had to enter into a virtual room and you had to, I mean, it's a bit cheesy, but if it's really well done, right? And you had this kind of, and you're like, that's a really nice idea.
I see a design studio theme. I just have a couple more, one more question, and then we can open it up to Q&A. You know, this whole period, you know, was also the context for a new consciousness, especially for white and privileged people, regarding structural racism across all facets of society. In this context, how can we articulate an ethics of teaching and research in library building centered on broadening access and inclusion? And, you know, I will say, just as a personal note, thinking about all of what's been going on in the world, it's really challenged how we find meaning in our immediate work. And so I just want to thank you all for helping me think through some of this, because it really helps kind of refocus and realign and widen and broaden my thinking. So I'd love some thoughts about some of this.
Echoing Hannah, definitely, in terms of like, so appreciative of this conversation, because it has allowed me to think about the archive, the institution, kind of, again, maybe these gaps, and maybe also like opportunities, and also ways that like the library has, and different library systems have kind of like stepped up to the plate without, you know, that in its most basic terms to kind of support their students in the safest possible ways that they can. I think that, you know, when we think about the future and how this kind of the kind of period of shift, I think that the idea is kind of it has to come from places like the library. Like, ultimately, of course, you know, increasing student voices is very important, and, you know, having maybe different expanded studios and different conversations. But at the end of the day, like, it has to come from like the places where the funding's coming from, or where the research grants are coming from, or the various kind of like sources of ideas that are kind of being produced, and as well as kind of tapping into different things like the alumni. I mean, GSAPP has such like a wealth and rich, diverse group of alumni, and I think that kind of revisiting those voices in terms of, and I think that's a lot about what I've been working towards in this workshop that I've been given the opportunity. Thank you again, Amal. But this opportunity to kind of meet with people, discuss people who've like helped to build the institution, and kind of understand, well, like, I didn't understand that there's such a diverse African American community, and really kind of what does African American community look like in a place like GSAPP? And I think that it's really kind of helped us to kind of push the boundaries of our understanding for that. And then just to kind of close, I think the experience has also kind of pushed us to like think more consciously about like each other and be more thoughtful in our practices, in our everyday lives, and in our kind of like in our writing, in our kind of one-on-one conversations. I think that that's kind of something that's been lacking. And, you know, aside, like adjacent from the institutional change that has to happen, it also has to change in like compassion, how we kind of carry ourselves, how we interact with like, you know, our peers, how we interact with our faculty, how we interact with the institution. We can see more of these kind of connections and more of an intersection versus kind of a hierarchies. And I think that we need to see that also, like we need to model that in our institutions so that we can see this kind of in a larger framework globally and in our governments. And so, thank you.
Some of this sort of reminds me of a conversation we had about highlighting certain pieces of the collection that folks might not know exists, which it goes into one of the good things about representation, that if you see yourself in the thing, then you're more inclined to be willing to be part of it. And I know that collections always want to show the best pieces, but then how are the best pieces these agreed upon pieces, but then who are the tastemakers and say that these are the best pieces? And then that they change. I mean, and in Avery, we have, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, we have all of these pieces that are on display. But if you go to one archive I told you all about before is Mother Bethel AME in Philadelphia. They have a museum about the founder of their church, Richard Allen, and on display there, they have the pews from the original churches. So but then those are the best pieces, some of the best pieces in the archive, but then it's telling a different story that people wouldn't necessarily know is there. Unless you know about that specific history, because it is a national American history, but it's not as well known as other pieces that would be on display in Avery. So how do we take that approach of taking things on and off and put it on rotation? Because I'm not saying that what's up there now is not important, because it is. It's just another conversation, different type of, or different engagements with the built environment that are important for education. But then how do we have other things on display so that when people do walk into the lobby of Avery, it's like, oh, okay, so there are different pieces that I didn't know were here, and make it a more dynamic space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I loved also, I mean, tying also what Kate and Charlotte and Atea, you were saying about each one of us is a collector, right? And you could tap into that collection. But also, I think in that sense, when the consciousness, I think that Kate is speaking about also is this moment when you're putting together your syllabus and you're realizing, why am I repeating the same voices, right? This kind of moment of saying, okay, well, is there an object there that I need to look for? Or, you know, I think this self-consciousness of like one's own collection is an amazing, I think that's a very real, amazing moment of kind of change and sort of growing that to what Charlotte is saying, that could we expose more of that, almost a kind of rotation and how to make things more, you know, visible or without, you know, it's this kind of tension between over curating and kind of projecting versus I think the need to sometimes kind of, you know, overexpose somewhat so that things start to be written about and researched. And of course I shared my dream of like, this should happen in the shared lobby of Avery and GSAPP, where we could have a kind of exhibition space for some of the material as students walk in, or, you know, some to kind of reinforce that. But I really love the idea of kind of exposing more and rotating and creating more accidents and encounters.
I guess there's one thing that I was sort of thinking about, which is, which kind of goes to sort of this coming year, which is that how, you know, what is it going to mean to do research again in a condition of extreme unevenness and inequality? You know, what does it mean for someone who's had access to a vaccine to go into an archive in somewhere in the global south where other people have not had access but are required to still come to work? You know, like, I don't know the answers to these, but it's been something that's been on my mind, given how this kind of this one new stage that we've come to is unfolding. And I don't know, I don't know what the answer is, but it seems like as we continue with our research, it's like there's a tension there, right? On the one hand, we want to bring all of this material back into our work and talk about it and make sure it doesn't get left out. You know, I mean, there's been years of man hours of students who've done their master's degrees in the pandemic who haven't been able to research this, you know, who've only been able to access what has been accessible. And that's just gone. That's gone, right? And on the other hand, we're not out of this yet as a globe, as a world. We're not out of this, you know. But New York feels different. And so what is it going to mean to kind of perform in research in this kind of unevenness, both emotionally, where you feel like you're through something, but the world is not, but also ethically. So I just had that thought.
That is certainly going to be a challenge. And I know, you know, we all are paying very close attention to these these town hall forums at the Columbia administrative level, telling us about vaccination requirements and masks and what to expect. And I know it's still very, very difficult to come to immediate decisions. But I've already heard, you know, well, if somebody chooses to wear a mask, will they be marginalized and not allowed into a building? Or I feel like this in-between period that you're talking about, Atea, even very local to Columbia's campus, creates some optical problems for people trying to do research in ways that they feel is the best, safest way for them. And I'm not, it'll be kind of an interesting limbo to clear, if you will, but it's going to be a challenge too. I'll say, you know, one of the fun things that has come out of these conversations with you is really rethinking physical spaces in the library in relation to making the spaces accessible, relatable, welcoming. I mean, Columbia, as you all know, accessing special collections within the libraries has a whole host of rules and regulations. Avery itself has a whole host of rules and regulations. You know, you can't bring in food, you have to be quiet. You know, there are all these things that I think to some of the uninitiated, let's just say, would seem incredibly daunting and also, you know, very exclusionary. And while we still have to maintain rules to steward our special collections and even our regular collections, it's really wonderful to think about what can we do with the Avery spaces that you know, make them relatable. I mean, I've been talking to our properties curator, Roberta Ferrari, about pulling things out of our art collection that might make the spaces a little bit more relatable. And there's just so much more to do than just that. But you know, it's people want to come back. People want to use our spaces. They want to use our physical collections. But I think we also have a real obligation to figure out how to do this in a way that's a little bit less traditional than has been the case. But that's not to say people can check out Frank Lloyd Wright drawings.
I was going to ask about that, actually.
Well, I want to save a little bit of time for Q&A if the folks out there, it looks like they have one question. So let me see, we've got one from David Hecht here. He writes, earlier in the conversation, as well as now with what Amal, Kate, and Charlotte described, has there been an opportunity in the past year, or is there an aspiration going forward to examine the structures of knowledge organization that may themselves be producing quote unquote gaps or keeping certain works out of this repeated display? And he qualifies that a bit more to say, what are the structural aspects of library and archival practice, and by extension research, that lead to the privileging of certain producers and works and the exclusion or diminishment of others? And how might awareness of these be integrated into the different practices to mitigate or reverse their impacts? So there's a lot there. Wow. Perhaps I'll punt to Charlotte and Kate and Amal first, and that'll give me time to think about my answer.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question because we can talk all day about how Avery could go out of their way, and not saying that Avery's not doing this, but to look at different collections. But it's true, because of the nature of the archive, it's a very, even though every human being collects material, the way that to be legitimate as an archive, it has to read a certain way. It has to have certain materials in it. And it has to often have somebody who has a library studies degree or a degree in that subject field of whatever the thing is being collected. So, which makes sense, but then it goes into situations about where did you receive your education in order to be appropriate for that, to be that curator of that archive. And it also reminds me of, well, I'm going to use Mother Bethel as an example again, but so all of my examples are always Philly related, but the archivist there was telling me that it's really difficult for her to retain material from the past pastors there because there's often association with historically marginalized people, specifically Black Americans, that our materials will go to waste if we don't take care of them. So, and that's not to say that that's a feeling or an attitude that's shared across the board, because we're not a monolith. People aren't monoliths, but I can see why that is a situation that didn't dawn on me until the archivist, who's also African-American, said that to me, that this was a situation. So it's how do you talk to people without talking down to them about the fact that their materials are important for everybody to see, but then is it also okay if we lose these materials? And then going back to what Kate was saying, lose in the sense of they're not pristinely preserved, because being preserved is a very Western attitude that we like to see our history, but it's okay if, going back to what Kate was saying in terms of oral narratives about materials that are gone also. So the terminology that we talk about these collections, how these collections are made up, yes, they do more or less impose the same structural injustices that are across the board, but then how do we situate ourselves within it and make have a nuanced conversation about it, but then realizing that oftentimes we are perpetuating these injustices.
I think responding to kind of the second part of the question in terms of we think about like awareness, for me, very much thinking about the fact that it's about like it's our responsibility as students and as researchers, as scholars, to kind of, I think, bring this to the forefront of these issues. And I think the schools, I think, this fall we'll see from GSAPP and from other schools, as Amal pointed out, expanded syllabi, different reading lists, different kind of really different conversations And I think it's just really about like, again, just awareness. It's about like having those conversations. If there's something in your class, in your studio that somebody brings up and highlights that's super problematic, it's about kind of bringing it to the forefront. I think, Charlotte, you can attest to this. We speak a lot about this in BSA. It's unfortunately, it is our responsibility as marginalized people in a lot of these conversations to kind of step up and make people aware of the kind of injustices that exist in the institution, in the archive. So I think that, you know, the way to kind of mitigate this is just to, like, one of the most important is just to have these like frank discussions and to have them at the moment. It's not something in terms of like, I think a lot of people kind of like want to go like hide or kind of just like throw something up on social media. And I think that this is, again, you know, because especially, you know, thinking of pandemic Zoom life, we have the opportunity to send somebody an email and say, you know, something that you said in this class made me very uncomfortable, or talking with our peers and saying, you know, we need to kind of address these issues because the language that you're using is just not kosher. So I think that that's, for me, is one of the most important things, is really those connections and really kind of, you know, understanding the consciousness that we, and kind of like the image that we want to portray as a community and as individuals at a place like GSAPP and at Columbia. So.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. And maybe tying this question, I mean, what strikes me here, it's always the human contact, but also the human brain that's ultimately making the connections, right? I mean, sort of situating oneself in a complex situation. And I wanted to tie this to your question that remained unanswered, Hannah, about the space of Avery. And maybe it's not the space itself, but going back to the librarians and, you know, being maybe more present, or, you know, as kind of active, you know, really visible and actively recognized as crucial in terms of inviting new connections, or access is always just it's often a person that's not behind a desk, but a person. I mean, I know in public libraries, you know, in the city, it's very much about getting the you know, the offices that we designed for the Dumbo Library is like, there's not a window, because the whole point is then, you know, everybody needs to be on the floor, everybody needs to be part of the community. And, you know, so I don't know, it's this human connection. And I you know, going back to how important the librarians were in this pandemic, I mean, but you know, you know, you know, kind of stepped in. So it's this stepping in of maybe not the library, but also the librarians to make those kinds of connections in an, you know, not always very structured and, you know, perfect way, but more of a sort of, oh, did you know about this, or did you think about that? Or I think these encounters are so rich because they're just almost like a detail, but it's a crucial detail that then opens a door.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think we have time for this question. Has the fact that buildings could not be visited increased interest in archive-focused projects? And similarly, will archival resources that were digitized by the time the pandemic started end up being disproportionately represented in researchers' conclusions in the future? That's really, really, really interesting. I think where we will, I mean, I'm trying to formulate a clear answer here. You know, I guess I'd have to hear from Avery curators, and I'd also like to hear from, you know, I'd love to see the list of in-process projects in the GSAPP PhD program. I mean, what has the pandemic actually hijacked in terms of access, and has that refocus created a new area of expertise, or a new sort of attention in the scholarship? You know, for us, it's been really interesting since we've been closed, and now that we're only open to Columbia affiliates. You know, as I was saying at the top of the discussion, the real power users of our collections have not been in our spaces, and And we've made some of these collections available online digitally, in particular, some of our Frank Lloyd Wright digital collections, well, one in particular, but you know, it's really kind of skewed the use of our collections. And so I wonder what our visiting scholars who would normally be using our Hugh Ferris collection or our vast trade catalog collection and classics, if they don't have access to this, then what are they doing? So I guess I'm still a little unsure of how people are pivoting in their research, but I know they must be. And there's more to the question, but maybe I'll let others jump in.
I had one thought, which is that, you know, which I was thinking about in relation to what Sarah Dreller has asked over here, that, and moreover, they can sometimes get even more suppressed when structural racism and misogyny play a role in decisions about which archival materials are worth digitizing. I think that in my experience, one of the best ways to deal with this is to find ways to support students in their projects, because when they lead with their interests rather than with material, you know, it's like, oh, go find material and then write about it. Rather, you know, start with research questions, start with your interests, and then find ways to get the library to support you. That's been a productive, you know, process to bring to sort of balance out some of the structural problems with art that archives sort of have baked into them, you know. And then that, I think, has been a way to then bring new perspectives that might be able to sort of enter archives against the grain.
And I think that, I mean, I don't know if we've talked about it here, but it's something you brought up, Charlotte, in the past, which is, you know, there's that human encounter, that human component that can help you translate the experience of using an archive, but it has to be done so in a way that's you know, incredibly benevolent and can sort of disabuse this stuffy notion that, you know, we have rules that are intended to marginalize rather than protect. And it's so easy to take for granted that, well, no, we're just enforcing rules, we're just protecting our collections. But for people that aren't used to this kind of thing, it can sometimes seem very, very off-putting, and send very problematic messages.
I think thinking through this a little bit, for me, it goes back to this question of like whose responsibility is the archive, and who owns the archive. Like, I feel as a user, who goes to it, or, you know, just graduated, but, you know, is at an institution like Columbia who has such a rich archive, like, I feel like I'm somewhat responsible for that archive because I use it, whether it's responsible when I was able to use the archive and physically touch the books and make sure to, you know, to wear gloves when I'm using these archival materials, to kind of, you know, you thinking through now, who do I share these rich materials with? Who do I let know that there's a gap in this archive? So I think that for me, this is our moment. I think, you know, there's the institution and across multiple scales has had too much responsibility in terms of what belongs in the archive. I think that, you know, as a student, if you think that something is missing in the archive, or, you know, we need to like bring in this voice, talk to your librarians, talk to your archivists. Trust me, they're always amazing, cool, decent people. And I think that for me, it's just so much more about like, we have to do it. You know, like, there's going back to the, you know, Black people having to always do the work, BIPOC, marginalized. Unfortunately, I think in this instance, we do have to do the work because a lot of people don't understand. They don't feel the pain that these gaps in the archive cause. Right? Like, I mean, Charlotte and I have a very different reading of someone who has a different like cultural background than either of us. So I think it's just very much like, you know, allowing yourself to have a voice and allowing the institution not to be the only voice, and kind of not recognizing these these rigid boundaries that may have existed or, may have appeared to have existed. Libraries are much more transparent than we would like to, we give them credit for. Same with the institution. Again, it's like, it's talking to people, it's bringing these issues to light. Like, for instance, this conversation didn't happen a year ago. There's a reason why this conversation is happening now. This is a time to share it with your friends, tell people it's on YouTube, share with other archivists that these conversations are happening and really kind of get that snowball rolling. I think that that's really the kind of power that we have right now. And it's not kind of looking at the past failures where the institution has not been maybe as accessible or as inclusive as it could have been, and really the opportunities of students, of alumni, of faculty to kind of step up and be responsible for the archive ourselves and really building that. So thank you.
That sounds great, Kate. I like it.
I think the audience can see the Q&A chat. Is that right? I don't want to read it if everyone can see it.
That's right.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So we have just a minute or two to reflect on this last comment. Curious what the other panelists have to, what their response might be to some of these questions.
Yeah, this is from, we're still talking about Sarah's second comment, right? Yeah, I just wanted to say, well, in terms of trying to make sure that we further don't lose voices, because that's something that I am very much concerned about, that there's all this fervor to actually go out of our way to make sure that we try to find these voices and or keep and highlight these voices, that when the outside pressure goes away, there's no longer a reason to do it. And I think we have to, I like what Atea said about the fact that, and this is very much true while you were saying this, that student projects very much, because they'll look everywhere at places and they'll be interested in different things, because they'll think outside of the box more so sometimes than we do. And we can help guide them in certain directions. But the fact that students are interested in global concerns, but then also local concerns that we wouldn't necessarily think of ourselves because our experiences are different, I think would help in this. But then also disabusing ourselves of certain titles and categories where something is important, if there's a famous name that's associated with it, or if it's a certain site associated with a certain event. So it's just, why can't it just be something that, okay, it has local significance, but we don't know the significance, maybe the people who are involved are not necessarily famous, but the cultural values are associated with it is something that needs to be preserved. And now I'm talking like a guerrilla preservationist now, but in terms of, we have to disabuse ourselves of the fact that it's the architect or the famous architect or this famous firm. And like I said, it's all well and good to have these things. I'm not saying we throw them out, but the fact that if it's a Black architect, does it have to be a famous Black architect? Maybe it's a Black architect that did a lot of work in the New York area and is just now getting recognition. We should include them. So different things like that, just getting away from, it has to be the best or the first of these things. Why can't it be something who's doing something different? I think would prevent, I don't know if it could, it will necessarily eliminate social injustices that suppress these voices, because there's a lot more work that we have to do, and we all have to be on board to do this. But I think it'll ameliorate some of the issues that are already there.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you all so very much for having these really, really engaging conversations and joining me to have a larger forum with some really important stakeholders out there. I really look forward to continuing the conversations. Thanks, Amal, for helping support this, and to Charlotte and Kate and Atea as well. It's just been a absolute pleasure talking with you all about this. And I'm looking forward to carrying on the conversation.
Yes, yes, hopefully not in little boxes. Or maybe a combination of little boxes and columns.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hannah. And so wonderful that you are thinking about all of this. And I really feel like as we re-enter Avery physically, you know, I feel that also the heart of it will be transformed as the library will kind of think about new ways to think about archiving knowledge and supporting new knowledge. So,
Thank you.
all right.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody.
It was just so great to kind of have this opportunity to communicate with like across the board, and just thank you so much to attendees and panelists. Looking forward to the future.
Likewise, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for calling in from Austria, Atea. You can go to bed now.
Is that where you are?
I am, yeah.
Wow. Very nice. Very
Now
nice.
we're gonna have breakout sessions, Atea. No, I'm just kidding.
All
Thank you all.
right. Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Take care.
Bye.